Genesis chapter 20 through 21, 1 through 7. Hear now the word of the Lord as he speaks through the prophet Moses. From there, that is Sodom, Abraham journeyed toward the territory of the Negeb and lived between Kadesh and Shur, and he sojourned in Gerar. And Abraham said of Sarah his wife, "She is my sister." And Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah. But God came to Abimelech in a dream by night and said to him, "Behold, you are a dead man because of the woman whom you have taken, for she is a man's wife." Now Abimelech had not approached her. So he said, "Lord, will you kill an innocent people? Did he not himself say to me, 'She is my sister'? And she herself said, 'He is my brother'? In the integrity of my heart and the innocence of my hands I have done this." Then God said to him in the dream, "Yes, I know that you have done this in the integrity of your heart, and it was I who kept you from sinning against me. Therefore I did not let you touch her. Now then, return the man's wife, for he is a prophet, so that he will pray for you, and you shall live. But if you do not return her, know that you shall surely die, you and all who are yours." So Abimelech rose early in the morning and called all his servants and told them all these things, and the men were very much afraid. Then Abimelech called Abraham and said to him, "What have you done to us? And how have I sinned against you that you have brought on me and my kingdom a great sin? You have done to me things that ought not to be done." And Abimelech said to Abraham, "What did you see that you did this thing?" Abraham said, "I did it because I thought, there is no fear of God at all in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife. Besides, she is indeed my sister, the daughter of my father, though not the daughter of my mother, and she became my wife. And when God caused me to wander from my father's house, I said to her, 'This is the kindness you must do to me at every place to which we come. Say of me, he is my brother.' Then Abimelech took sheep and oxen and male servants and female servants and gave them to Abraham and returned Sarah his wife to him. And Abimelech said, 'Behold, my land is before you. Dwell where it pleases you.' To Sarah he said, 'Behold, I have given your brother 1,000 pieces of silver. It is a sign of your innocence in the eyes of all who are with you. And before everyone you are vindicated.' Then Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech and also healed his wife and female slaves so that they bore children. For the Lord had closed all the wombs of the house of Abimelech because of Sarah, Abraham's wife. And the Lord visited Sarah as he had said. And the Lord did to Sarah as he had promised. And Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age, at the time of which God had spoken to him. Abraham called the name of his son who was born to him, whom Sarah bore him, Isaac. And Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God had commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. And Sarah said, 'God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh over me.' And she said, 'Who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age.'" This is God's holy and inspired word. Whoever has ears, let him hear. Well, if this story sounds familiar, it should. Because almost the same exact thing happened back in chapter 12. Not in Canaan with Abimelech. By the way, Avi, father, Melech, king. My father is the king. It's not a name, it's a title. It's the title of the king in that area. So it didn't happen there. It happened in Egypt with Pharaoh. Now, if you're wondering why essentially the same exact story is being repeated, if you're wondering why Moses would waste precious ink and papyri, it was very expensive. If you're wondering why he would repeat the same narrative, or if you're disappointed that Abraham continues to let us down, or if maybe you think, what a waste of time, we have to hear this story again, then you'll be shocked to hear who this story is really about. The point of this story is that just as Abraham is presented as the faithless pilgrim here, just as Abraham continues to not learn the lessons that God is teaching him, the point is that Abraham's story is your story. The story of faithless pilgrim Abraham is the story of the faithless Christian pilgrim. And so that's what we're going to see today. The faithless pilgrim Abraham, the faithless Christian pilgrim, but most of all, what God does to overcome our faithlessness. The story of faithless pilgrim Abraham is really about the faithless Christian pilgrim and how God deals with our faithlessness. Abraham, the faithless pilgrim, the faithless Christian pilgrim, and how God deals with the faithlessness of his people. So let's begin with our faithless foreigner, our sorry sojourner, the error-prone exile, the pathetic pilgrim Abraham. Verse 1. Abraham journeyed toward the Negeb, living between Kadesh and Shur, and he sojourned in Gerar. Translation: Abraham is a sojourner, a foreigner, an alien, a pilgrim, and he has finally arrived in Canaan. He's there. He made it. It only took him 100 years to get there. The pilgrim has sojourned into the promised land. He made it. What is a pilgrim? We may be tempted to think, when we hear this word pilgrim, of the 17th century English pilgrims who continually had to leave where they were because they couldn't practice their religious observances the way they wanted to. They were continually persecuted, and they eventually ended up here in what we now call the United States. We may be tempted to think those are pilgrims. Well, they are, but technically, a pilgrim is anyone who is on a journey to a sacred place for religious purposes. Anyone who is on a journey to a sacred place for religious purposes. God promised Abraham a land, and Abraham has thus been a pilgrim throughout his entire life. And now he is in the promised land. After decades of sojourning and dwelling in tents, he's there. Now think of what we've seen thus far from Abraham. We've seen the good, and we've seen the bad. We've seen the peaks, we've seen valleys. We've seen highlights, we've seen lowlights. For example, his faith has been one of the highlights. God said, go. And so Abraham went. Abraham believed God's promises, and it was counted to him as righteousness. So we've seen that his faith has been highlighted. Interestingly, his pilgrimage has also brought out his lack of faith. Think of what we've seen with Abraham. Think of the lowlights. Think of the valleys. His faithlessness in Egypt, abandoning his wife, adultery with Hagar, the birth of his illegitimate son, Ishmael. Those are some lowlights. All of these events have served to demonstrate that Abraham, the father of all believers, was at times faithless because he trusted not in God, but he trusted in himself. Abraham, despite God's continued faithfulness throughout his journeys, continues to trust in himself. When we hear these stories, we think, why can't Abraham just get his act together and trust God? God always takes care of him. No matter what the problem is, God always takes care of Abraham. It seems like even when he makes mistakes, he gets rewarded for it. As we just heard, here's some servants, here's some stuff, take it. Here's some money. God continues to be faithful. Why can't he just get his stuff together? Well, the reason why is because Abraham is a real person. He's not a one-dimensional character. Like us, Abraham is real, and Abraham makes mistakes. We've seen that Abraham is prone. Isn't that funny? The father of all believers is prone to faithlessness. And he has made mistakes along the way. And he's just made another mistake, and it's a big one. And he's done it twice now. He arrives in Gerar, which would be modern-day Palestine, just so you can picture it on a map. They asked about his wife, and once again he says, oh, she's my sister. Just don't kill me, take her. So Abimelech took Sarah, brings her into his household. This is the second time that Moses has recorded this for us. Probably it's happened more than those two times. But you remember the first time he received a rebuke from Pharaoh. He comes into Egypt and he thinks, oh, these are godless people. I better lie, keep myself alive. And it's Pharaoh who ends up lecturing him on morality. Isn't that interesting? Abraham appears to not have learned from his previous rebuke by Pharaoh. Because rather than trusting God as he makes his way into the promised land, rather than trusting in the promise that he just heard, that we just heard 2 weeks ago, this time next year, Sarah will bear a son, and you will call his name Isaac. Rather than trusting in the promise when it really matters, you can hear it, but then in your sojourn, you start to forget. And that's exactly what Abraham does. Rather than trusting in the promise when it matters the most, he resorts to his old ploy. She's my sister, not my wife. Take her, just don't kill me. He thinks that the only way that the two of them will be preserved is if he helps God. That's a mistake. To think that the only way God can remain faithful is if we help him. To think that God needs our help. I have to cease trusting in God. I have to put my faith over there so that God will remain faithful to his promise. There's a few interesting things about this story. I'm sure you noticed some weird stuff that may come up. I know they popped up in my mind the first time I read them, like, what? So let's take a look at these. I don't want to get too bogged down in the weeds, but it's important to take a look at these things. Okay, first, is this really a lie? Because, I mean, what does he say towards the end of the story, right? He says, well, I didn't lie. I mean, she is my sister. She's related to me on my father's side. So is this a lie? What do you think? Yes, it is a lie. Because he deliberately withholds the most relevant information. Okay, the most relevant information is this is his wife. It would be like if someone said, hey, is this your wife? And you said, her dad is so-and-so. Oh, okay, her dad's so-and-so. Great. Is it your wife? He's withholding the most important information, and the dictionary definition of lying is just that. He's deceiving. That is the definition of a lie. So that's exactly what Abraham does. He lies. And the reason for his lie is because he doesn't trust God to be faithful to his promises. He doesn't trust God. I need to help God, Abraham thinks. God needs me to assist him in his faithfulness. Great is thy faithfulness when I help thee. And that's what he sings, right? You need my help, God. Pretty good singer, right? Second, that's the first thing that pops up in my mind. Second, wait a second, I thought incest was bad. What's going on here? Is it now normal? What's happening? Well, there's two things to note on that. First, several scholars point out the fact that Moses never really provides a genealogy for Sarah. This is the first time anything with respect to her family is mentioned. And that's a little fishy. Okay? So when Abraham lies, and then he goes and he covers his lie by saying, yeah, but she's really my sister. She's related on my father's side. Really? How come this is the first time we're hearing about that, Abraham? I mean, this is chapter 20. We've been with you for 50 years now, and you're just now telling us that? Why is this the first time? Most commentators say it's because it's another lie. So Abraham's covering up his lie with another lie. Oh, I didn't lie. See, she's related. Okay, or that's a lie. So there's one thought. Secondly, another option, as Calvin points out, is the term that is used here for sister can also mean cousin. So that would mean on my father's side, she's my cousin somewhere down the tree. common way of talking about an ancestor, whether it's a father, a grandfather, a great-grandfather, is to just call them father. Just like a term for a grandson, a great-grandson, a great-great-great-grandson would be offspring. And so it's possible that they're second, third cousins, something like that, which actually was very common during the patriarchal period. It's still common today in that area, but very common in the patriarchal period. That's the period of Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, marrying, having an arranged marriage with a cousin, a second cousin, a third cousin, in order to keep religion in that family so that you're not sending someone off to marry pagans. So that is quite common. These are all possibilities to think of, okay? It was common practice at that time. The final oddity here is regarding Sarah, and this may be the strangest one to really wrap our minds around. Now, we know that Sarah was beautiful when they were in Egypt, right? She was beautiful in Egypt, but that was 25 years ago. She was 65, and now she's 90. Who would steal a 90-year-old? No offense, and I mean that sincerely. I'm not trying to be offensive, but who would steal a 90-year-old? Come on, right? It's kind of strange. So what's going on here? Two possibilities. First, we have to remember that Sarah is about to be pregnant, right? Sarah's about to be pregnant. Therefore, you know those hormone things that start working? You know what I'm talking about. The pre-pregnant hormones that women get, they're raging in her. So there may be a sort of change in her appearance. Meredith Kline puts it this way: her rejuvenation is remarkable enough to revive the attractive wife problem of earlier years, and Abraham resorts to his old strategy. Additionally, this is clearly about power more than it is anything else. As several commentators point out, it would have been standard in the ancient Near East, in order for someone to forge an economic relationship, to give up a woman or to give up women, much like a gift or an offering. Kind of crazy, but that's the world they were in. That's history. So hopefully that helps you with some of the questions that pop up. You know, I didn't want to get too bogged down in it, but those are things that pop up in my mind, and I'm sure they pop up in yours as you heard that story. And we need to understand them in order to realize that this is actually a true historical account. And the bottom line here with Abraham is that he continues to believe that it's up to him to find ways for God to remain faithful. That really is the story of Abraham. God needs me in order to remain faithful. But in doing this, we see over and over again, Abraham is really just lacking faith. And in that way, I think we can relate to Abraham. Don't you? We should see ourselves in this story. As we enter into our second point, just like Abraham, we need to humble ourselves and be reminded that there are times when we too, sadly, are faithless pilgrims. There are times during our sojourn, during our pilgrimage, that we are faithless pilgrims. Now, you may be thinking, I'm no pilgrim. I was born here. I was raised here. I went to school here. I live here. And unless I move to Florida, I'm always going to live here. I'm not a pilgrim. I'm no sojourner. We're not strangers and aliens. This is our land. Recall with me the words of the Apostle Peter as he speaks to Christians. This is really important. This is why we read from it for the reading of the law. Beloved, I urge you as sojourners and exiles to abstain from the passions of the flesh. Sojourners and exiles. Other translations say, I urge you as strangers and pilgrims, aliens and foreigners. And beloved, in the same way that Abraham was a pilgrim, a sojourner, a stranger, so too are we. It's true. And once we wrap our minds around this fact, life will really start to make more sense. Once we realize that we are strangers and aliens living in a foreign land, as we make our way through this Christian life, life will make more sense. Strangers here and now, and we are on a pilgrimage to a better, sacred, holy city. And as we have heard over and over, it's the same city that Abraham was looking forward to. Hebrews 11 goes through it and says, he's looking forward to the heavenly Jerusalem. And that's exactly what we are looking forward to. We're on the same pilgrimage as Abraham. But this pilgrimage can get difficult. As Ian Duguid puts it, we live in the gap between the promise and the reality. We live, like Abraham, in the gap between what God has promised and what we can see. Does that make sense? There's this gap, a reality gap. The gap between what has been promised, the offspring promised to Abraham, the promised land, eternal life, and then the fulfillment of that promise where it's concrete. Living in the gap was not easy for Abraham, and oftentimes, like Abraham, as we live in this gap, we make mistakes. Sometimes we even make the same stupid mistake 2 times, just like Abraham. We, beloved, are faithless pilgrims who at times lack faith because we don't always see what God is doing. We have a different view of what is happening than God does from his throne room. He sees everything. God has made promises to us. I will be your God and you will be my people. He's made an offspring promise, which has already been fulfilled. But we don't see Christ right now sitting on the throne of God, do we? There's a gap between what God has told us is true. Christ is sitting on the throne at the right hand of the Father, reigning and ruling over all things. And Hebrews says we do not yet see things as they truly are. So what does that take as we live in this gap between promise and fulfillment, between what God has said and what we can see? Guess what that takes? Starts with an F, ends with eighth. Living between the promise and the reality is difficult. And that's what this story is about. And that's what the Christian life is about. Sometimes we forget this, right? Like Abraham, we rely on ourselves. Like Abraham, we forget how many times God has been faithful to us and taken care of us. We come up with reasons why God may not be faithful this time around. We come up with reasons why God needs our help in order to remain faithful. And often we excuse our lack of trust by fooling ourselves into thinking God needs us. Think of some examples in your own life. In what ways has God been good to you? In what ways has God continually demonstrated his love for you and for your family? In what ways has God shown you his power throughout your Christian life? In what ways has God been faithful? Beloved, there are so many ways. But how many times have we forgotten that? How many times has God forgiven us because we've forgotten that and restored us even though we don't deserve it? How many times has God shown us his goodness and yet we turn the other way? How many times have we relied on our own efforts instead of trusting God? What's going on in your life right now? Maybe it's your health. Maybe it's relationships. Maybe it's work. Maybe it's your finances. Maybe it's your family. What's going on in your life? We're dealing with this gap between God's promises and the reality is a struggle. And let me ask you, why do we think God isn't going to be faithful this time? Why do we think that? Maybe he was before, but that was in the past, and now he needs our help. Abraham and Sarah did the same thing, and they did it more than once. In what ways are we different? We forget God. We don't trust him completely as we should. All too often, the Christian pilgrim forgets. The Christian pilgrim gets too busy for God. The Christian pilgrim sets our mind on earthly things rather than on heavenly things. Over and over, the scriptures tell us, trust me, I am faithful. Over and over, God gives us reasons in our life, concrete reasons to continue to trust him. Lest you be tempted to think, well, what has God done for me? You hear the gospel every week, right? You feast on the body and blood of Christ almost every week, right? You get to see feel, hear, taste the goodness of God week in and week out. In these things, beloved, God is saying, I am faithful. I am worthy of your trust. And yet we pull an Abraham over and over and over again, don't we? I want you to consider what Duguid writes concerning this. If you want to follow along, it's on page 5 of the bulletin. Now, I've said Duguid several times this morning. If you're wondering who Duguid is, Dr. Duguid taught Hebrew at Westminster and other seminaries. He has a commentary on Genesis, and I love it. It's called The Gospel According to Abraham, Living in the Gap Between Promise and Reality. Living in the gap. Listen to what he says as he helps us to understand ourselves in light of today's faithless Abraham narrative. Listen. Abraham should have known better. Yep. He had the promise of God, right? He was supposed to be living by faith. Whatever happened to his earlier attitude of, God said it, I believe it, that settles it? Yet isn't that precisely the problem that most believers face? Living in the gap between promise and reality. Yes, Dr. Duguid, it is. Our problem is not with the doctrine of God's sovereignty and care or with the big issues of our walk with God. Rather, our problem is with the practical application of God's promises to the details and difficulties of our daily walk. So the question is, beloved, can we apply our outstanding theology to our Christian lives? Duguid continues. Yes, God has promised X, Y, and Z. I've memorized these verses to prove it. Yes, I believe it and proclaim it on Sunday, but what about Monday? When in the cold light of day, the situation looks distinctly unpromising. What about those times when obedience just seems too hard and faithfulness to God seems to cost too much? For example, we sing, "Great is thy faithfulness" on the Lord's Day. Do we remember that on Monday? Much less Thursday, right? So how do we turn our faithlessness into trusting God in all things? How do we do that? How do we trust in God in every situation? With our knowledge of who God is and what God has done, how do we turn that into faithfulness in the Christian life? How do we turn that into increased faith? That brings us to our final point. We must comprehend. Not just hear, but comprehend. It must be in our hearts, in our minds, in the very core of our being, what it is that God has done for the forgetful and faithless pilgrim that we are. We see in our narrative that once again Abraham is restored by God, and not just restored, but restored like tenfold. And they make sure his wife is vindicated in front of everybody. And he receives stuff and the land that God promised. God is faithful. God always takes care of him. Not just here in chapter 20, but look at chapter 21. God says, look, I told you. I told you I would do it. Isaac is born. The reality is here. God is faithful. They can feel it as they hold Isaac in their hands. As Sarah nurses, they can feel God's faithfulness. They can see God's faithfulness. But what about us? For us, the offspring of the woman has come. What more does God need to do to prove his faithfulness? What does he need to do for us? Beloved, God is faithful. Therefore, let us draw near with a true heart in full assurance of faith, as Hebrews says. And let us hold fast to the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promises is faithful. Do you believe that God is faithful? The incarnation of the Son of God, God with us. The perfect life of Christ, God for us. His penal substitutionary death on the cross, where he assuaged the wrath of God and removed the sin of those who belong to him. His resurrection his ascension, his pouring out of the Spirit on his church, his great commission, his promise, I will be with you. The gates of hell will not prevail against my church. All of these things demonstrate God's faithfulness, do they not? And thus the gospel must lead us to trusting him more and more, not less and less. Have we been united to Christ by the power of the Spirit? Does a good tree produce good fruit, or does a good tree united to Christ and by the power of the Holy Spirit produce thorns and thistles and rotten fruit? A good tree, a tree that's united to Christ by the power of the Spirit, produces the fruit of the Spirit. And guess what faith is? Faith is the fruit of the Spirit. Evidence of a true and lively faith. That's what good fruit is. Are we going to be perfect? This story, along with almost every story in the Holy Scriptures, teach us that we are not going to be perfect. But God is. And he is faithful. That's who he is. It's in the very character of God. That's why we heard in our assurance of pardon, the Lord, a God who is merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. Beloved, the faithful God is our God. And if we are indeed united to him over time by the power of the Holy Spirit, we make less and less mistakes and grow more and more in Christ. And produce the fruit of the Spirit, as Paul says in Galatians 5:22. The fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, and faithfulness. Wow. And those who belong to Christ have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. Wage war against your faithlessness. Wage war against that, relying on yourself as we live in the gap between God's promises and the fulfillment. Trust God. Trust his goodness. Don't doubt it. So we've considered the faithless pilgrim Abraham. We've shined light on our own faithlessness. But most importantly, we have seen how God deals with the faithlessness of his people by remaining faithful in all things at all times. For even, Paul says, even when we are faithless, he remains faithful. Look no further than the cross. Look no further than the good news of Christ for us and in us. And beloved, that is good news for faithless pilgrims. Therefore, we'll close with the words of the preacher to the Hebrews as he exhorts the flock of God. Let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is now seated at the right hand of the throne of God. Amen, and thanks be to God for his great faithfulness.